In 1986, when these two games were released almost a month apart, no one thought that more than 10 years later, the latest Castlevania game would bear a striking resemblance to a Metroid game. Now, Castlevania was built around a stage-by-stage approach like most platformers of the time. It was slow and methodical, it had a great level design and really good enemy placement. But the Metroid series is all about exploration. A year after Castlevania hit the market, Castlevania 2 was released. It had its flaws, but I thought it was still a fun game.
Castlevania 2 wasn't as highly regarded as the first Castlevania game. So, when Konami made Castlevania 3, they went back to a stage-by-stage linear approach.
The Metroid series did have a somewhat different outing on the Game Boy in Metroid 2 Return of Samus, but it didn't feature exploration as heavily as its console counterparts. The fact that Metroid 2 was a handheld title meant that, as popular as it was, it still wasn't as widely known as Metroid and Super Metroid. So the middle child syndrome a lot of big-name game series on the NES saw wasn't as prevalent. My point is that no one really expected Konami to release another game that kind of mirrored what they did with that middle child game, Castlevania 2. While Symphony of the Night was very highly regarded, when it was released, fans almost immediately started drawing comparisons to Super Metroid.
Super Metroid was developed by Nintendo R&D 1 and programmed by Intelligent Systems. The 15-person team included some very notable Nintendo personnel, such as director Yoshio Sakamoto and producer Makoto Kano. The game was released on a then unprecedented 24 meg cartridge in the spring of 1994 to critical acclaim. Super Metroid features incredible graphics and music and a huge world to explore. Samus is on a mission to save the baby Metroid she discovered in the previous game, Metroid 2, from the dastardly space pirate Ridley. After chasing the kidnapper back to the planet Zebes, the stage of the first Metroid game, Samus must collect an arsenal of weapons and equipment to prepare herself for the final confrontation with Mother Brain. The planet Zebes is a big place, filled with varied and lively areas to adventure through, and lots of secrets to discover. It's easy to get lost if you don't know where to go. Sometimes that's part of the fun, and others it's just a recipe for frustration. Samus controls like she's on a foreign planet, and it works for the game. Even though her jumps aren't always completely precise, it still feels like it should. I don't really know any other way to explain it. The imprecise jumping mechanics just feel right. The game isn't too tough, though it'll challenge you plenty, in both combat and exploration. Bosses can be hard, but so can the run-of-the-mill enemies that you encounter often if you aren't careful. As I mentioned before, you can get lost, and while sometimes that's okay, other times it's just frustrating, especially when you wind up running around the huge map trying to find out where to go. It doesn't detract too much from the overall experience, however. It's a fantastic game. Konami released Castlevania Symphony of the Night in 1997. Assistant director Koji Igarashi wanted to take the series into a new direction after seeing numerous Castlevania games in bargain bins throughout Japan. The new style of game was created to give players more replayability than a linear side-scroller had to offer. Released as Devil Castle Dracula X, Nocturne in the Moonlight in Japan on the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn, Symphony of the Night was quietly released in North America and saw success due to the power of the word of mouth, making the game into a noteworthy and popular title for the Sony PlayStation. Symphony of the Night throws back to Castlevania 2, with an open castle to explore and very little linearity. You must find the correct skills and items to get Alucard to the end of the game and the final face-off between him and his father, Lord Dracula. While you have to find the skills to open up new paths and areas, there are plenty of opportunities to stray off the beaten road to find secret areas and treasure. Controlling Alucard is very solid, and his speed of movement and the amount of control he has in the air is a completely new direction for the Castlevania series. No longer do you have to commit to jumps, as you can control yourself mid-air, making jump correction a ton easier than it was in earlier games. The game relies on you to defeat enemies to gain levels, making Alucard stronger. There are a massive amount of items to collect as well, with various different types of weapons, armor, and artifacts that can affect stats and how you approach your enemies. Magic spells are available as well, but I don't often rely on them, instead defaulting to brute force of my sword or whatever weapon I have equipped at the time. Symphony of the Night is an amazing game, and one that any PlayStation owner should consider owning.
When I first decided to talk about the similarities of these two games, I had never played them back to back. There are obvious similarities between the two, sure, but there's also a few that I didn't really think about until after playing them. Maybe a lot of you viewers out there who are a lot smarter than me already have it figured out, but I think it's still interesting to see them side by side.
Both Super Metroid and Castlevania start with an intro stage before really getting into the meat of the game. You're playing as Richter Belmont in Symphony of the Night, and the end of the intro doesn't really tell you much of what this gothic adventure is going to be about, unlike in Super Metroid, where the intro scene is very much the launching point of Samus's adventure.
So what's the similarity here? Both games have intro stages, so what? Well, what if I told you we're looking at the wrong comparison points? The intro stages aren't mirroring each other. Symphony of the Night's intro stage is mirroring Super Metroid's intro cutscene.
Yeah, think about it. Super Metroid's story starts off showing scenes from the previous game, Metroid 2, where Samus discovers the baby Metroid. Symphony of the Night starts with an intro scene recounting the final battle in Dracula X, Rondo of Blood.
The similarities between the game's early stages don't really end there either. Some of these following things happen a bit out of order, but they're still worth noting.
At the start of the main adventure, our hero and heroine both make pretty slick entrances. Samus in her ship and Alucard by the way of vampiric sprinting through the forest and jumping through the closing gate. Until a certain point where the action takes off, both the starting areas have no music with only ambient storm sounds. Symphony of the Night picks up into a great upbeat rock theme once Alucard kills enough of the initial sentries when the castle lights up and comes to life. Same goes for Super Metroid. The music doesn't really pick up until Samus collects her Morph Ball enhancement and is scanned by a security camera, awakening all the creatures on Zebes. Following a very easy entrance for Alucard, he meets someone he knows from his past, who promises,
"We will meet again,"
takes something, or some things, dear to Alucard, and escapes. The same happens to Samus, as a space pirate from her past shows up to take this fledgling creature that thinks of her as its mother.
Wait, what does Alucard have that's so dear to him? He just loses some equipment. Well, let's take a look at a description on one of those items that he loses, shall we?
Alucard's sword, named the Alucard sword, is actually an heirloom from his mother's family. How important is his mother to him? Well, take a look at this scene where the half-vampire, half-human protagonist is stuck in a nightmare, reliving a tragic moment from his past.
These points for both of our protagonists are the inciting incident for the action in the game.
Samus is surprised to see a foe that she's vanquished in the past, and has to save the larval Metroid before it's turned into a weapon. Alucard is merely investigating why Castlevania has appeared so soon, but once Death shows up and divulges a bit of information, he knows this is a major issue.
Maybe I'm stretching it a bit here, but these instances still seem pretty similar to me. I mean, this could be just the case of two stories using a similar narrative structure. It's not an Avatar Pocahontas level ripoff or anything, and I don't think anybody's accusing Symphony of the Night of doing that. But in relation to each other, and the types of games they are, I think it may be more than just a subtle influence that entered the minds of Konami when producing this game.
After the inciting incident, both characters start out pretty weak. Death having taken Alucard's equipment, it leaves him with very little along the lines of defense against the horrors that fill this castle. Much like Alucard, Samus arrives on Zebes with very little in her arsenal. Her power-ups from the previous game are gone. Samus is much less powerful than when we left her last on SR-388. Both protagonists are without their equipment to start their mission.
The main theme of both games is exploration, and this is where the very obvious similarities come into play.
Castlevania's map is one of the first points that people look at with a sense of déjà vu. Yes, you have seen this before, in Super Metroid. Sure, the colors are a bit different, and Super Metroid adds a few extra helpful points of interest, but you can't deny that this one was definitely inspired by the other. Both games have different areas that are broken up by themes. Metroid has its botanical area in Brinstar, a wrecked spaceship, and a water area, Meridia, among others. Castlevania has several different wings of the castle, like the Alchemy Lab, a library, and the Clock Tower. Of course, all the hidden areas and hidden items are present in both games. Blast or hack away holes in the wall to access various nooks and crannies, uncovering all kinds of goodies. In some cases, you'll have to find the secret locations to complete the game.
Outside of the similarities I've listed, there are others, but a lot of these are simply video game tropes that all kinds of video games share, such as returning enemies ranging from minor baddies to bosses and finally the end boss. But these games aren't simply carbon copies of each other. Castlevania Symphony of the Night uses many established RPG elements, such as gaining levels to increase stats, making Alucard stronger, and equipable weapons and armor.
Super Metroid is not nearly as varied when it comes to the sheer amount of attack items and spells that Symphony of the Night gives players. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Where Symphony of the Night prides itself on a greater number of options, Super Metroid makes the most out of the weapons and power-ups Samus has at her disposal. Obstacles in the level design feel a lot more thought out and focused in Super Metroid as a result. That isn't to say that the areas aren't well designed in Castlevania. The entire castle is designed to be playable both right side up and upside down. Some architectural features that just look like simple decoration in the first castle are used to hide dangerous traps in the upside down counterpart, for example. The big difference between the two games is that where Super Metroid makes great use of every skill in Samus's inventory, there are a lot of skills Alucard acquires that either don't remain useful for the entire game or aren't useful from the get-go. Most of the magic spells that Alucard can learn, including the one that gives him his dad's fireball shooting ability, just don't really get a lot of use. They don't help you progress in the game at all. Some of the artifacts that are designed to help you get to certain points within the castle aren't used very often. For example, the wolf transformation isn't necessary other than once or twice when you have to use its size to get through an area. Super Metroid doesn't really run into this problem. Every item is useful in more than one location throughout Zebes. Whether it's needing to use a pesky ripper as a grappling point, having to use the speed booster to gain enough speed to jump across a chasm, or use the morph ball to explore all the tiny passages throughout the entire game, everything gets a good amount of use. Nintendo made you use every single new piece of equipment, and kept them all relevant until the end of the game. You didn't have a single weapon or item that was not needed.
A major difference between Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night is character development. And I don't mean character development in the narrative sense, but in the video game sense. In the sense of this character is gaining more power throughout the course of the game. While Super Metroid isn't very linear, especially compared to other games from its generation, Samus herself progresses very linearly.
As I mentioned, Samus only gathers a limited number of power-ups and equipment compared to Alucard. Each of these are equipped to make Samus more and more powerful, but you don't have any control over the end result. Samus always ends up with a gravity suit, powered with the plasma beam, and various alternate weapons at her disposal. This gives you very limited tactics when approaching the final boss of the game. You're going to blast Mother Brain with powered-up charge shots, missiles, and super missiles. Alucard, on the other hand, can be equipped to be a physically offensive powerhouse, a heavily defensive character, a magic user, or reliant on hard-hitting one-use weapons. Stats can be altered to make him more effective in one tactic versus another. Personally, I almost always just go for more damage and decent defense. It gets me through the game pretty easily, other than that asshole in the flipped catacombs. Otherwise, Symphony of the Night gives you a level of control over your gameplay style that Super Metroid doesn't offer. This makes for a different experience and even gives you another reason to come back to play it another time.
There is also a difference of setting, but both present a creepy atmosphere using a fantastic combination of music and graphics. Even being on a 16-bit system, Super Metroid still holds up fantastically. Symphony of the Night is no slouch either, and still looks very good. It's really a matter of preference here. I'm personally a bigger fan of swords and sorcery and paranormal than sci-fi stuff and space adventures, but only in that, if I had to choose, gun to my head kind of way. I absolutely love the setting of both games.
Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night are two similar games that are rightly compared. They both have the same exploration aspect that defied the popular linear and level-based structure of side-scrollers of the time, and they both did it very well. To say that Symphony of the Night is simply a ripoff would be a misinformed statement. While it was very likely inspired by Super Metroid, it was its own game, also drawing inspiration from video game RPGs as well as its own roots.
To sum it all up, they're fantastic games, and have spawned an entire genre that gamers lovingly call Metroidvania. Both Castlevania and Metroid continued to spawn Metroidvania-type games on Nintendo handhelds like the Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo DS. Castlevania Circle of the Moon and Metroid Fusion are two that come to mind. But both series have since evolved into the 3D realm, with one having better critical success than the other. So what game do I consider the winner between Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night in my very first video game face-off? It's up to opinion. What do you like more? Do you like gothic paranormal adventures? Or are you a bigger fan of sci-fi? Do you like RPG-like options with all kinds of different weapons, items, and magic spells? Or do you want a more straightforward approach with more focused level design and focused use of your powers that you gain throughout the game? It's a matter of opinion, man. That's really all I can say about it. They're both fantastic games, again. So, you'd do well to play both. That's all I got. I appreciate you guys watching. If you want to see more of these video game face-offs, let me know in the comments. Is there anything I missed? Anything that is similar between both games, or something that's so different between both games that makes them uncomparable? I don't know. Let me know. Throw me a sub, throw me a like, throw me a comment, and I'll see you guys later.